Welcome back to day 12 of this 14-day San Francisco sourdough bread making tutorial. In the first week, we made our brand new sourdough starter, and in the last video we went through a very simple hands-off recipe suitable for complete beginners. If you haven't seen that video yet and would prefer to start with an easier recipe, go ahead and tap or click here. So today we'll cover the first half of a more hands-on recipe for those who already know how to make bread, or for beginners looking for a bit more of a challenge. If you're following the series live, feel free to bake along with this video because it'll cover everything you need to do up until the point you put it in the fridge for the overnight nap. Then in the next video we'll cover what you need to do when you take it out of the fridge tomorrow to bake. As with the beginner's recipe, I'll give you plenty of space to pause the video at each step as we go, but there will also be a link to download the recipe in the description below. I've put an example of timing on each step again to show you how you could make it over the course of 2 days, but obviously you could adjust this to start your bake whenever you'd like. Okay, let's get started then. First up, we have to build our levain. I'll assume you're already a pro at this, but you can see the day 8 video if you want a refresher on how to do that. For this recipe, you'll need 139 grams of levain, so that should look like this, with 30 grams of ripe starter, 105 grams of filtered or bottled water, and 105 grams of white flour. Now we've talked about how traditional San Francisco sourdough bread is made only with white flour, but for this recipe, if you'd like, you can substitute up to 5% of that white flour for any other flour that you think might add an interesting twist to the flavor profile. So now this is where it starts to diverge from the beginner's recipe. Instead of just chucking your ingredients together, we're going to stagger them to maximize our gluten development and our final dough strength in general. So for that, we'll jump straight into our autolyse phase. For this phase, you'll start around 2 hours before your levain is expected to peak, and all you need to do is mix your flour and water together. No levain yet, and no salt. Then just pop a cover over the top to stop it from drying out, and store it next to your levain so it comes up to the same temperature as the natural enzymes in the flour go to work developing the gluten for you. Here's the demonstration from the day 8 video of how much of a difference the autolyse phase makes on the dough. 2 hours later, and we'll just confirm our levain is ready with a float test, before adding a bit of water to make it easier to mix into the dough. We're still not adding our salt yet though. You'll want to give the starter a chance to really take hold before we put the salt in, which actually inhibits the starter a bit. So we just mix it in enough so it comes together, as you can see here. You'll notice that instead of mixing it in its bowl like in the beginner's recipe, we've dumped it out onto our work surface. Not only does this let you handle and develop the dough better, but it also allows you to scale up to larger batches to make 4, 5, 6 or more loaves in a single batch if you'd like. When we're done, we just pop it back in its container, and it's back to a warm spot for a quick rest. After 45 minutes, the dough will have relaxed, and the starter is slowly taking over your until now lifeless dough. So now is when we add our salt and then start to build some strength into the dough. By holding that little bit of extra water out until now, we have an easier way to get the salt dissolved and spread throughout our dough. Then it's just a matter of developing the strength in your favorite way, and that could be as simple as just hand kneading it like this. Since the dough in this recipe is really wet though, I like to use a combination of hand and bench scraper to start things out like you see here. Just use the heel of your hand to knead the dough, and then use the bench scraper to fold it back into a ball. The quintessential technique for developing really wet dough though is the slap and fold. It can seem really difficult at first, but it's really just a couple of simple movements that you'll be able to learn and commit to muscle memory in no time. I remember seeing a YouTube video when I was learning that used a towel, so let me see if that might help you out as well. So you grab the dough on either side and lift it up. Then, still holding onto the top of the dough with both hands, you throw the bottom of the dough onto the work surface, and then flip the dough up and over itself. Finally, you grab the other two sides so that it turns 90 degrees, and then you simply repeat. Okay, so now that we folded our towel nicely, let's get back to our dough. So again here, we grab it underneath near the top, lift it up, and then whack the bottom down while still holding onto the top. Then stretch it a bit while you flick it over itself. So now let's see how that looks at full speed. So this is really the best way that I've found to develop a really wet dough, both in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. If you haven't tried it before, it will feel a bit awkward at first, but I promise you'll get it down pat in no time. I will warn you now though, with a really wet dough you could find bits of dough on the ceiling after you're done, so do be careful. So when you're done with that, the hard work is all behind us now and we get to move into the bulk fermentation phase. Now that it's rested for 45 minutes, the dough is relaxed, and we can see this by trying a window pane test where we stretch the dough out and try and see if we can see through it without it breaking. That's a great sign that there's a lot of strength already in the dough, but now we're going to supercharge it with a technique called lamination. With lamination, you stretch the dough out into a thin sheet just before its breaking point. Then you fold it over on itself repeatedly like a croissant dough, or roll it like a cinnamon roll dough. Either way, you're aligning and developing that gluten network to produce lots of great strength at the last possible moment, just before the dough starts to get nice and airy from all the work of your starter as it grows throughout the dough. After it's all rolled or folded up, just roll it up one more time lengthwise to get it back into a ball. Then it's back into the container and back into the warm bulk proofing spot for 30 minutes. Which brings us to the next dough strengthening technique of stretch and folds. If you've already followed the beginner recipe, you'll already know this one. But a stretch and fold is a standard technique where you'll pull up at the edge of the dough until just before it breaks and then fold it over. Then continue doing this around the container until you really can't stretch it anymore without it breaking. Then you cover it back up and leave it to rest again. You'll then just have 2 more bulk fermentation periods with 1 more stretch and fold in between those. Now we're done with our warm bulk fermentation phase, and it's time to shape our loaves before we put them down for a nap in the fridge. Go ahead and tip it out onto your work surface, and then use a bench scraper to divide it into 2 equal loaves. Now we're going to up our game from the beginner's recipe and use a technique for shaping that I call the stitch and roll. To do this, just spread your dough out gently, then pull the top down about 1/3 and tap it into place. Then do the same for the bottom. Next, imagine a shoelace pattern, and you need to grab at each section up and down the loaf and crisscross in the middle. When your hands cross, simply pinch the dough together to hold that section in place. You need to do this pretty quickly though, so it doesn't pull itself apart before you're done. You can repeat this up and down twice if you still feel there's more give in the dough, but it's usually not required. Once it's all done and the dough is nice and taut, just roll it up from the bottom and then pinch the sides to seal the rolls. Then round it up with your bench scraper to make a nice proud ball, and you're all done with this pre-shape. Just go ahead and leave them where they're at for a 30-minute bench rest. After that, you'll be back for a second shaping. All that's usually needed is a simple rounding up with your bench scraper, but if your dough is really slack, then you might want to do another stitch and roll at this point. Just be careful, because if you shape it too much, you'll end up really degassing your dough. Then one more little rest to allow the seams to seal, and then we're on to the final shaping. You can add a light dusting of flour if you want, then one more quick rounding up to tighten the loaves a bit more, then 5 more minutes rest to let the seams seal again, and then we're finally fully shaped. Now it's a really wet dough, so you want to take precautions so it doesn't stick to the banneton when it rests overnight in the fridge. The first thing you want to do is flour the now fully shaped loaves themselves with all-purpose flour. Then for the bannetons, you'll want a mixture of rice flour and all-purpose flour for best results. If you don't have rice flour though, plain flour won't work as well, but it'll still work fine. After you carefully flip the loaf into the banneton, give the outer edges one more sprinkling of flour to make sure it doesn't stick as it grows a bit more overnight. And then you're finally ready to rest it in the fridge overnight, where the tang that makes it San Francisco sourdough will finally come to life. So there you go, you're done for the day. Tomorrow when we take it out of the fridge, it's just a matter of scoring it and baking it, but we'll leave the details of that to the next video. But that's all for today's class. As always, I hope you're enjoying this series, and I'd love to hear about how things are going for you on your journey, even before tomorrow's bake. And if you like this video, it would really mean a lot to me if you could tap like and subscribe and maybe even share it with a friend. Either way though, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the conclusion of the advanced San Francisco sourdough recipe. Bye for now.